Welcome back to A Considerate Life. Last time in the video Philosophy 101, we described a broad approach to philosophy, its intricacies in metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And there I laid out for you what my personal commitments are in the areas of a philosophy of being, a attitudes toward human knowing, and then ethics or moral theory. Today we want to apply those to a philosophy of gender. Now, again, my background is philosophy and theology. I'm not a gender studies person. I'm not a scientist. And what today's video is going to offer us is a philosophical analysis of gender. So starting with metaphysics, this is a study of reality. And we talked about last time that every concrete particular is a composition of form and matter. The human is a specific composition of soul and body. So as we ask the question about gender, what is gender for humans? We have to ask the question, is it part of the soul or is it part of the body? Is the soul inherently sexed or gendered, or is the body inherently sexed or gendered? Now, there's a debate among Thomists, Aristotelian-Thomists, as to whether or not gender should be located on the soul or the body side of the soul-body composition that is the human being. Now, John Finley has an article called Metaphysics of Gender, a Thomistic Account, published back in 2015. And in 2020, William Newton has a response to John Finley. And I'll leave that latter article in the description because it's publicly available. The other one is behind a paywall for a specific philosophy journal. So I don't really think everyone has access to that. Anyway, in the Newton article that's a response to Finley, he says this: Finley is clear that sex is an attribute most strictly said of the whole substance, the body-soul composite, rather than of the soul alone. He says, like sensation, gender is a characteristic of the composite substance stemming from the soul. And so Finley's point is that there is a relationship with the body and the soul such that it is the gendered soul that accounts for the particular form of the individual body that becomes male or female. Now, Newton is going to push back on this, I think, for some very good reasons. So we'll just list off in several quotations Newton's responses to Finley, because these are my own responses as well. I basically mirror Newton in his response to Finley, because these were exactly the sort of objections that I raised in my own mind as I was reading through the Finley article. And Newton just does a very good job of saying them very concisely. So Newton says this: yet to say that the composite is the subject of sex does not answer the question as to whether being male or female stems more from matter or from the soul. That was my first response to Finley, because Finley has this analogy between the gender of an individual and their sensation. It's this idea that sensation, the eyes themselves don't see. It's the animating power of the soul working through the eyes that causes sight, and then from that, understanding. So Finley uses that as a model for saying that it's the soul, it's the animating principle of the soul working through the body that causes this composite expression of male and female gender. And as he says that, my first response was, well, that doesn't distinguish between sensation, handedness, temperament, all of these human experiences that are personal or individual, are ultimately expressions of an animating soul. Otherwise, we'd be a corpse, right? So it really doesn't distinguish how gender emerges from this kind of soulish animation of bodily functions. And so I think Newton is right to point out that Finley, when it comes to the very salient issue, really kind of skirts the issue itself. So these are two reasons that Newton gives why we should not locate gender on the soul side of the equation, but rather the body side of the body-soul equation, composition. He says this, and this is the second reason. The second reason to affirm that sex stems from matter, or the body, is that the contrary position, that sex stems from the substantial form of the soul, seems to compromise the unity of the human species. Male and female humans would be different species. The substantial form determines the species. So if the soul is feminine as such, or male as such, then we're dealing with two distinct species. And again, that was one of my objections that occurred to me as I was reading Finley, is that humanity, the rational soul being the form, the substantial form of the body, the substance, the substantial form is what makes a species what it is, right? And all the other forms are accidental. We said that last time. So if gender distinctions between male and female are located in the soul, which is the substantial form of the body, then we're talking about a distinction in substance, which means that they're not identical in substance, which means they're different species. So either men would be genuinely human and women wouldn't, or women would be genuinely human and men wouldn't, or neither would be really human, right? But for there to be one human species that expresses itself as male and female, then we cannot locate the male-female distinction at the level of the soul, which is a substantial form. And finally, Newton says this: the third reason, which is closely tied to the second, is that what pertains to the individual and not to the species as such falls on the side of matter, not the soul. Now, clearly, sex is proper to the individual and not to human nature as such. Hence, sex stems more from matter than from the soul. So that's the Aristotelian-Thomistic metaphysic as it applies to gender. The human as being an unembodied soul, a body-soul composition. The question is gender a soulish matter or a matter, right? And so following Newton, I think we should say that biological sex or male-female gender is something that is on the matter or the physical or the body side of the equation in terms of what makes it human. Now, we said that the three major branches of philosophy are metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, the study of reality, the study of human knowing, and then the study of moral values. So moving on to the epistemology aspect of a philosophy of gender, the question is, how do we know? How do you know that some individual human being is male or female? How do we know their gender? The first question is, what is gender? And we said that that should be put on the matter or the body side of the equation. Now the question is, how do you know that? Now, for somebody like Frederick Wilhelmsen in his book, Man's Knowledge of Reality, an Introduction to Thomistic Epistemology, he says this, that Aquinas really doesn't have an isolated epistemology as such, as we would see in the modern era after Descartes and then responses to Descartes. What we see rather in Thomism is we see that Aquinas' theory of knowledge or theory of human knowing stems from two different things. Philosophical anthropology. What is the human as a knower? What are its powers? What are his powers of knowing? Sensation and intellection. And then what are the objects known? And so between the powers of the knower or its strengths and limitations and the objects known, there emerges this thing called human knowing, and it's multifaceted. It's very it's very rich in its nuance because it's not just about the knower and the knowing powers, but it's also about the object known. So enough of that. How do we apply these epistemological categories to the question of gender? And I think it's really on the side of the object known, right? So we said that in classical empiricism, that everything in the mind, what we know about reality, is via the senses. The senses, the five senses, are what, it's that power of human knowing that puts us into contact with the extra-mental world, the things outside of our mind. And then the mind has access to the extra-mental world because it interpenetrates the senses in the one unified human knower. And we're not going to rehearse all of that. So in the perception of gender, What does it mean for me as a human knower to know another human being as male or female? And I think now that we've located male-female distinctions on the body side of things, I think the right answer is this, and it stems from the notion of dimensive quantity. Remember, we talked about Aristotle's 10 categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation. Those are the four main ones. And then aspects of a relation: agent, patient, or action, passion, time and place, position and possession. And we don't need to rehearse all of those. Right now, we just have to go with substance and then quantity. Now, when Aristotle uses the term quantity in a metaphysical context, he's talking about what we think of as dimension, right? Now, there is a dimensive aspect to the perception of species. So elephants, giraffes, humans, all have a distinct shape, right? You know, here is a video of elephants, and here's a picture that I drew of an elephant. Even in this crass two-dimensional picture, you can pick out the species elephant because it has a kind of dimensive quantity. It has a kind of dimension associated with it: the long trunk, the big body, the stump-like legs, things like that. So there's a species level dimension that can demarcate elephant, giraffe, human, right? But then at the level of the individual of a species, we tend to pick out male and female, like a male lion versus a female lion. The male lion has a mane, right? The female lion doesn't. The male tends to be bigger, more aggressive, things like this. These are the biological distinctions that pick out in a dimensional way male versus female. Now, the most obvious aspect of this for humans, how do I know in terms of, is external features, genitalia to be specific. Now, this is what also grounds some recent confusion. And I mean confusion not in what do I think about it, but being confused as to how somebody can say this. So for example, this is a screenshot of the Army's policy on transitioning or transgender soldiers. And if you look there at the bottom of that one vignette, I think it's vignette 8, it'll say something about soldiers being uncomfortable showering with female soldiers who have male genitalia. And the reason this sort of notation is confusing is that when we look at a philosophy aspect like epistemology, how do I know something? The question is, how do I know if this individual human is male or female? And the most obvious answer is genitalia. Right? There's this external feature, this aspect of dimension. You know, genitalia is an aspect of the physical dimension of a individual human being. In the Philosophy 101 lecture, I said that good philosophy is that philosophy that gives an explanation of what we already know pre-philosophically, right? There's a common sense element to what we know. And good philosophy is that philosophy that comes alongside common sense and simply gives a philosophical explanation of what you already knew to be the case, but in more perhaps technical terms and categories. And that's what we're trying to do here. How do I know that a individual human is male or female? You know, ultimately it's genitalia. It's based on this dimensive quantity that distinguishes between the sexes. Now, on that notion of common sense, I was recently traveling, and I thought I would reread George Orwell's 1984. It's a fairly small book. It travels lightly, as it were. And I came across this quotation, and I thought it was extremely poignant given the current discussion. He talks about this. He says this, talking about Winston, the protagonist. He says, He picked up the children's history book and looked at the portrait of Big Brother, which formed its frontispiece. The hypnotizing eyes gazed into his own. It was as though some huge force were pressing down upon you, something that penetrated inside your skull, battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make the claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense. And so I see this attitude sort of running amok in the culture, this denial of common sense. And as a philosophical realist, this is something that is troublesome to me because of my classical empiricism. I think that when we say that we know something, the basis of that knowledge, in order to be true, it has to extend from the mind, these true judgments, back to its grounding in reality, sensible reality, knowable reality. And so it becomes disconcerting to read things from something like the army talking about a female soldier who has male genitalia, because if what I know from my senses is not what's actually true, well, then we're pushed all the way to skepticism. What do I know about anything if I don't know these things? So like I said, good philosophy, I think, takes what we already know to be true and then gives it a more technical categorization. Now, the final area of philosophy is ethics, and I admitted this last time. Ethics is not my strong suit. But in terms of thinking about a philosophy of gender in these broad categories of being, knowledge, and the good, I would say this. The most obvious problem in our culture is the notion of justice. If we're going to locate an ethical issue that emerges, it's the notion of justice and biological males competing against biological females in athletic competitions. Now, for a long time in athletic competitions, performance-enhancing drugs, PEDs, have been banned. The reason they've been banned is that this notion of fair play, which itself is a subspecies of the notion of justice, right? The notion of fair play is that an athlete should compete against another athlete without having, in this case, an artificial advantage. An artificial advantage by taking EPO or steroids or something like that. Well, if a transgender athlete, a biological male, is competing against biological females, they don't have an artificial advantage over the competitors. They have a natural advantage. But the idea of fair play, which again is an aspect of justice calls for athletes to compete on a level playing field. Whether that's an artificial advantage or a natural advantage, there should be no other advantage other than the individual athlete's skill at the particular sport, whether it's speed or strength or accuracy, something like that. And in order to maintain fair play, I think we have to have a clear and biological distinction between male and female. So that is a philosophical approach to gender, looking at metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And whether or not this argument is convincing, that's not the point. The point for my audience is this. There are different debates that we can have over the notion of gender. We can have a scientific debate, right? I've seen some of the guys in the Daily Wire engage in that. We can have a theological debate, which brings in elements of revelation, whether that's the Torah or the Quran or the Christian Bible. But this is a philosophical analysis. It's an analysis that doesn't necessarily appeal to science. It doesn't appeal to some revealed authority. It appeals to metaphysical categories, epistemological principles, ethical principles that themselves could be accepted by anyone who understands the relevant principles involved and is convinced that they track with reality or that they themselves are good philosophy. Now, I said that my background is both philosophy and theology, so next time we'll look at not a philosophy of gender, but a theology of gender. And in that, we will bring the Bible into the analysis, and then we'll talk about God's role in gender.